What do you want to talk about?
One of the things I've always found interesting about The Shining, the movie, I haven't read the book, I don't know how to read, is how it has this reputation for being this complicated, mysterious monolith filled with vague symbols and hidden meanings. Like, there are documentaries about people's theories and conspiracy theories about this movie. People write books about it. Sometimes they even make embarrassing videos. And to a certain extent, I get it. It doesn't have an epilogue in a hospital room or something, or a psychologist explains to us what happened, Psycho style. It uses mostly kind of opaque, observational storytelling, where the only real interiority we get is from a 5-year-old with psychic powers he doesn't understand, and a man who is basically nuts to begin with and only gets worse from there. And, of course, there's the Kubrick of it all. The man made 2001, so this movie's probably as complicated as that. But I disagree. I've always found The Shining to be incredibly straightforward. Metaphorical at times, but straightforward. 2001 is pretty straightforward too, but that's another conversation for another day. At its essence, I think The Shining is one of the great portraits of regressive masculinity in all of cinema, certainly horror cinema. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What is regressive masculinity, how it is portrayed in the film, and perhaps most importantly, why the film is more relevant now than ever given the MAGA hellscape we are about to plunge back into. So don't change that station, we're gonna have fun.
Come, family. Sit in the snow with Daddy and let us all bask in television's warm, glowing, warming glow.
Honestly, this portion of the video could have been an entire video or series of videos all on its own, so I'm going to try and keep things really brief. The MAGA movement is comprised of many different, sometimes contradictory parts, a spectrum of terribleness. But for my money, some of the strongest glue that holds all the racism and misogyny and fiscal irresponsibility and fight-picking together is what I'll call regressive masculinity. Basically, regressive masculinity is the bizarro world version of traditional masculinity. It's negative image, the Wario of Charles Ingalls. Warles? It is a warped perversion of traditional masculine values and behaviors, and it has found a particularly fertile home in the festering rectum of the MAGAverse.
There's got to be a better way to say that.
In a sentence, the regressive man just doesn't like girls or girl stuff and finds those things stupid or gross or threatening or somehow all three.
I don't know what phallocentric means, but no girls!
Regressive masculinity is rooted in negative responses to social movements of the 19th and 20th centuries that were for, by, or involved women, basically in any way. Men who opposed things like women's education, abolition, temperance, labor reform, and universal suffrage typify the classical regressive man, particularly if they somehow view these movements as threats to their own personal well-being. For example, instead of a household now having 2 votes and twice as much electoral muscle, a woman's vote could negate the man's vote, undermining his will. As 20th century feminist movements redefine female gender roles and interrogate repressive social structures, the regressive man begins to be suspicious not only of women, but of anything he considers female-coded, including girl emotions like affection and learning.
Ha! Gay!
The traditional masculine role of protector turns into that of controller. He is not meant to keep his family and community safe from harm, but to ensure his place at the top of those structures by restricting the behavior of others. This manifests in any number of ways, the most obvious and worst of which include violence and sexual, emotional, or verbal abuse. But it might come out in more benign, dumber ways as well. A man feeling threatened if his wife out-earns him, or pursues a career at all, or has her own bank account, or if he has a female manager or co-workers, or if girls want to listen to rock music or play video games. The kids call this toxic masculinity, but I think that term misses something really key. The regressive man is not simply toxic to those around him and himself, though of course he is. And he is not just a dick or a clueless man-child. The regressive man is regressing, actively, perhaps ignorantly, but often intentionally, back through the layers and progression of modern and even traditional society to an atavistic, amoral state where he has obligations to no one but himself, and those around him are there only to satisfy his desires. This is why it is so important to distinguish between regressive and traditional masculinity. If Laura Ingalls told Pa that some guy she didn't know in town was getting handsy with her, Pa would ride into town and beat that man senseless until Mr. Edwards has to forcibly restrain him because that person was harming his daughter. Pa chooses violence. If, on the other hand, Laura tells her story to, say, Matt Walsh or Jesse Waters, she's getting questioned about what she was wearing and how she was acting and being told that it wasn't that bad and he probably didn't mean anything by it. That's just the way the world is, sweetie. So, to sum up, the traditional man provides to his family and community. The regressive man withholds. The traditional man protects those around him. The regressive man controls them. The traditional man supports others. The regressive man suppresses them. The traditional man takes accountability for his actions. The regressive man blames others for his failings. The traditional man is balanced by the female. The regressive man is threatened. Anyway, let's talk about The Shining now. Setting aside the supernatural elements for a moment, The Shining is at its core a story about a man who hates his family. And that comes straight from the top. Diane Johnson has said that when Stanley Kubrick asked her to write the screenplay, that was a key point of his focus.
Its underlying story of a father's hate for his child and his wife, the murderous father, is a very, very frightening one.
While we're here, let's say some quick words about Diane, who I don't think gets brought up enough when we talk about this movie. Did you know this was the only film she ever worked on? She was primarily a novelist, and Kubrick asked her to work on the movie after being impressed with her novel The Shadow Knows, a novel which coincidentally was about a woman whose life is thrown into chaos when she becomes convinced her husband is trying to kill her. So, that's interesting. Anyway, why does Jack hate his family? Essentially, it is one of the classic regressive man patterns. He feels his family is stifling him, emasculating him in a sense. He is unable to do what he wants because of them, and especially has no interest in providing for or supporting them, so he resents their presence. These are my examples, which range from subtle to glaring. From the outset, Jack seems annoyed by Wendy and Danny. It bugs him when Wendy doesn't know where the Donner Party got stranded and has to correct her. It bugs him that Danny didn't eat his breakfast. Then it bugs him that Danny learned about cannibalism on TV of all places.
See? It's okay. You saw it on the television.
To Jack, everything and everyone is dumb and morally deficient except him. Jack seems distant with Wendy as they are being shown around the hotel for the first time. She points out how fun a party in the gold room would be, and his answer is like, yeah, sure, whatever, like he's dismissing a silly child. When shown their apartment, his response is a reluctant, almost sarcastic,
Well, it's very, homey.
guess who can't wait to spend a bunch of time with his family? The only time Jack really seems at ease is during the interview, comfortably within the male structure of employment with a clear alpha to submit to and a matronly secretary to bring in coffee sometimes. However, Jack never does any of the work he was hired to do. He writes his book, while Wendy takes care of the family and does all the maintenance stuff. Jack avoids spending time with his family, telling Wendy he should probably do some writing rather than take her for a quick walk after she brings him breakfast in bed. He also feels her support and encouragement are irritating, even patronizing.
Well, something'll come. It's just a matter of settling back into the habit of writing every day.
Yeah, that's all it is.
This leads to his first major freakout at her when she tells him it's going to snow the next day. We learn that Jack is suspicious of Wendy and that he thinks she is turning his son against him by telling Danny that Jack might hurt them. As the movie progresses, Jack fails to take accountability for his actions, specifically his past physical abuse of Danny and alcohol. He is the victim of that situation because he feels Wendy has failed to forgive him for something he didn't mean to do and is therefore not culpable for. At this time, we also learned Jack's true feelings about Wendy specifically and women generally, and they are...
Just a little problem with the old sperm bank upstairs. Nothing I can't handle, though, Lloyd. Thanks.
Women can't live with them, can't live without them.
Not good. Overall, Jack sees women as alluring traps, hideous monsters, helpless leeches, and nagging harpies. To be fair, I guess, Jack's feelings in this instance are brought about by Wendy incorrectly accusing him of hurting Danny again. But his response is not to go look for whoever did hurt his son, or even to try and clear his name. It is to sulk and petulantly lash out at Wendy, then to be irritable when she says there is someone else in the hotel with them and he needs to go be a protector. In addition to his family, Jack is threatened by Halloran, whom Jack feels racial animus towards, but who is also living the life of an unfettered bachelor, which might make him feel jealous. Jack lies about his experience in room 237, where he was a cheating horn dog, then gets mad at Wendy twice.
Twice? 2 times.
When she says they should leave and get Danny medical attention, and of course obviously attempts to kill them because they're preventing him from doing his work or whatever. Their metaphorical emasculation of him, which is the greatest of all sins they could possibly commit. The trappings of regressive masculinity even creep in elsewhere. The movie is steeped in what I can only describe as creepy, wholesome Reaganism, even though it was released before the man was even sworn in. Jack's family is treated like and referred to as some ancillary appendage to him by Ullman and also by Jack.
I better collect my family first.
Oh. Yes, very cozy for a family.
Very cozy for a family. That's weird. Wendy isn't hired, even though she is shown around and presumably told how to do at least some tasks, in addition, of course, to working in the kitchen. There's just the baked-in assumption that she'll be helping out. There's even the weird throwaway line about the hotel being built on an Indian burial ground, and the only comment anyone makes about it, that workers had to repel several attacks while they were building the building, is almost treated like, I don't know, like trivia? Or like cocktail party chit-chat? Some, oh, how quaint they were type of joke. It's weird. All of this is contrasted by Wendy, who feels like a holdover from the more socially liberal 60s and 70s, while the world around her feels like the impending juggernaut of the social conservatism of the Reagan 80s. You can picture her with her colorful jackets and stacks of paperbacks going to campus protests and smoking grass or whatever. Maybe even with Jack. He's a writer, after all. In my headcanon, they probably met in a literature class. Then, as their lives progressed and they settled down, he turned into a frustrated writer and she started being a little less free-spirited and avoiding arguments for the sake of her son. Remember, it's only been like 3 years since Wendy could have her own bank account, but something tells me she probably doesn't. Maybe we're getting a little away from the actual text of the film, but what I'm saying is that basically everything in this movie is focused on depicting or foregrounding the regressive man, his habitat, and his attendant horrors. So, what about those horrors? What about the supernatural stuff? I said at the beginning that this movie has a reputation for being complex, even undecipherable. And I think that reputation comes from its supernatural elements. I'd even go so far as to say that, taken in isolation, the paranormal stuff, especially the "you've always been the caretaker" stuff, in this movie doesn't really add up that well, which of course leads to lots of straw grasping if you are relying primarily on these elements to construct a reading of the film. The problem is that The Shining is a haunting narrative, but one that doesn't really adhere to typical haunting tropes and structures. Haunting stories are usually based on a simple cause and effect. A specific bad thing happened in the past, so an individual or location is haunted in certain ways in the present. The story then has to do with discovering and resolving that cause from the past to stop the haunting, or failing to resolve it and being consumed by it. Freddy Krueger, the child murderer, was killed by vigilante parents. So to exact his revenge, he haunts their children in their dreams. A development company built houses on top of a cemetery without moving the bodies. So the spirits of the people buried there are angry and live in the TV of exactly one of the houses in the development. Pretty simple. On the surface, The Shining feels like a typical haunting movie. Here's a place where a lot of bad stuff has happened over the years, and people who are extra receptive to psychic energy can pick up on it. There might even be ghosts, but that's where it kind of breaks down. The narrative isn't focused on resolving whatever happened in the past, like putting the souls of the Grady girls to rest or whatever. I would even argue that Jack and his family aren't haunted by anything in the hotel. Narratively speaking, the hotel acts more as a catalyst for Jack's behavior than a typical haunting agent, subjecting characters to its own actions. The setting serves as an environment in which Jack can stop repressing his innermost feelings about his family.
I've contained my rage for as long as possible, but I shall unleash my fury upon you like the cross!
It's not like at the beginning of the movie he's a normal, loving family man who is corrupted by some evil force. He already has a history of violence and bad behavior, even if he hasn't necessarily thought of actually killing his family yet. And we see before they get there that he doesn't really like him anyway. The hotel, and whatever psychic presence Jack taps into there, essentially empowers him to be his worst self, and his warped, regressive tendencies take over. This is, of course, a fight he loses, regressing to the point of incoherent, animalistic shouting in the maze before freezing to death. The supernatural elements of the story are essentially metaphors for Jack's psychological state, not plot points. The woman in room 237 isn't part of a mystery to be solved, it's just Jack projecting his warped, conflicting views about women. This is another thing Diane Johnson says Kubrick was interested in exploring and portraying. She says he was more focused on the psychological realism, or at least realness, of what was happening with Jack, not spoopy ghosts or whatever.
There was always a question about to what extent the supernatural was real. His understanding was very much more at the thematic and psychological and human level than just wanting some visuals with people sneaking down halls with knives and stuff. He wanted it to make sense in real psychological terms.
This isn't even the first time Kubrick has taken on the subject of regressive men. Dr. Strangelove is about just that. A bunch of regressive men, paranoid about their virility, essentially enacting nuclear Armageddon so they can retain their place on top of society and feel manly. The only real difference is that Dr. Strangelove is a dark comedy and The Shining is a horror movie. In the end, the main thing haunting this family is, well, Jack, and the regressive masculinity he embodies. Once he is neutralized, the haunting is over. It's true that Wendy and Danny both encounter malignant paranormal forces in the hotel, but Danny's attack by the woman in room 237 primarily serves as the trigger for Jack to start thinking about killing his family, and from Wendy's point of view, might just as well have been committed by Jack anyway. And Wendy's trip through the haunted house at the end feels more like a visual metaphor for the breakdown she is obviously experiencing after the trauma of her husband trying to murder her with an axe. The only real danger she and Danny face comes from Jack, who is really acting on his own deranged impetus, the potential for which was there all along and had likely been growing for years. It was merely accelerated by the environment of the hotel. You don't really get the sense that they would eventually be consumed by the hotel or whatever, that one of them would go mad if they were just staying there by themselves. It's to the movie's credit that essentially saying all the scary stuff is just a metaphor doesn't undercut the horror of the narrative or feel like a cop-out. I mean, after all, that's like sophomore English class levels of interpretive triteness potentially. But I think it works as a reading, and the reason it works is because the 2024 election was about a lot of things, and Donald Trump won it for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that clinched it for him was appealing to and normalizing regressive masculinity. He has always been a regressive man, don't get me wrong, but something about the tone felt different this time, right? He did his usual shtick of lazily stirring up grievances among his supporters, which obviously appeals to the regressive man crowd as it always has. But I would say the biggest difference was what those around him were saying. At this point, no one is really shocked when Trump says something wildly misogynistic, but there was a bold frankness in what, say, his running mate or other Republican lawmakers or conservative media figures were saying that does feel new. Saying the quiet part out loud, or just no longer using euphemisms to cover their nakedly sexist views in decent clothing. Comments about cat ladies and the societal functions of postmenopausal women. Gripes about women in the workplace or women undermining their husbands' votes. Yeah, that happened this year. Appearances on Turd Bro podcasts. Anything Elon Musk says. The tone no longer felt like, us white people are underdogs actually, or us men aren't respected anymore, or we're sure sticking it to those elites, they hate this. It was more gleefully, openly, knowingly cruel. It was punching down. There's not a lot of shame in being a misogynist anymore, or at least concern about the optics, or pretending. They know there are enough of them now that it doesn't really matter.
Once something has been approved by the government, it's no longer immoral. Yeah!
Locker room talk happens on prime time, with the kids watching. We see this in the response to the election. Stuff like actual piece of scrotum cancer and alleged Nazi fantasizer Nick Fuentes posting, "Your body, my choice, forever," and the obvious vindictive relish with which that sentiment has spread around the manosphere.
Please don't call yourself fat.
Where one might at least try to argue, though I wouldn't, that regressive men were still an underground class before the election, now it's clear that they have not only infected the mainstream, they are the mainstream. They have burst through the collective subconscious into the open air, and like Jack Torrance, they have a mission and a purpose. And like Wendy, we get to watch in horror as the world we thought we knew mutates into something else before our eyes. An adjudicated rapist and felon ascends to the presidency, not by electoral technicality or court intervention, but by broad national consensus. His picks for key cabinet positions feature men credibly accused of and investigated for sex crimes, actual sex crimes, including trafficking, and everyday men around us. People we work with and who live in our neighborhoods and who didn't used to act this way proudly pledge their allegiance to this new regressive order, even as it makes their wives and daughters less safe and reduces their chances for success. And for some of them, that kind of feels like a feature, not a bug. The thing that makes The Shining so disturbing is that Jack Torrance can lurk inside of anyone. Not that anyone could turn into him if pushed, but that anyone could already be him and just needs to be let out. All he needs is the right catalyst. I'm not saying that MAGA boys are going to all turn into axe murderers. This is what is called in fiction a metaphor. What I am saying is that there are a lot of men who feel a lot more empowered to be the worst versions of themselves than there were a few weeks ago. That's why this movie now, perhaps more than at any time since its release, feels so relevant. Jack has always been the caretaker. I don't know, maybe that's one reason why there are so many gonzo theories about this movie. A plain interpretation like this is too uncomfy for some people to stare in the face. Perhaps you see some of yourself in Jack Torrance, and perhaps what you see of him in you don't consider all bad, even though you know it is. It's clear now that Jack has universality to him, so isn't it more fun to say The Shining is about like the moon landing or whatever, and not, you? I maintain that The Shining has one of the most incisive and therefore most horrifying portrayals of regressive masculinity in all of cinema, but that does not come without its own poisons, because in many ways the movie itself embodies that of which it is making a horror spectacle. I think it's pretty common knowledge by now that Shelley Duvall had a horrible time making this movie, to the point that her mental health was drastically impacted, and who she was as a person, and certainly as an artist, was deeply changed. It is well documented that director Stanley Kubrick put her through the ringer while shooting this movie, to put it lightly. There was, of course, his penchant for shooting dozens and dozens and dozens of takes for individual scenes, a process many actors find fatiguing if not demoralizing. But he did that with everybody. With Shelley, he took things further. He felt that in order to get his desired performance from her, he had to make her basically feel like Wendy. So he was at least psychologically manipulative with her, if not actually abusive. I don't think that included violence, but there was a lot of verbal berating in front of other actors and crew over the course of a fairly long shoot. For a long time, this mistreatment has been downplayed by fans and critics. I think it was hidden in part by his image as a demanding genius auteur and our perception of that as a good thing, and by Shelley's image of being kind of weird and our perception of that as being a bad thing. We are quicker to suspect her of exaggeration or fabrication than we are of him being, at the very least, a really crappy boss. Or we say things like sometimes high art has a high price, that sometimes artists need to suffer for our enlightenment, but one need only look at the abundance of great art that didn't destroy the person who created it to know that is a hollow excuse, particularly when it lets the bad behavior of powerful people off the hook. I've already said that The Shining wasn't the first time Kubrick investigated regressive men. You could argue that regressive or otherwise complicated men form one of his favored subjects, be the genre war film, historical epic, dark comedy, horror, what have you. I think this is probably why Stephen King hates the film so much. Kubrick took his fairly personal story about a man dealing with alcoholism and turned it into a psychological exploration of the worst type of man there is. In doing so successfully over so many films, you could also argue that perhaps the monsters we know best are the ones we harbor ourselves, whether or not we know it. I'm not saying that The Shining wouldn't exist without Kubrick treating Shelley Duvall the way he did, but I think whatever insight Kubrick the filmmaker had about his subject when conceiving it and choosing collaborators like Diane Johnson didn't seem to apply to the behavior of Kubrick the man while he was on set making it. It is a blind spot that threatens to engulf the finished film completely. I don't have anything else to say about this, but I think it's something that should be acknowledged as part of a complicated film's complicated legacy, especially now that Shelley is no longer with us. And I think I'll let that be the final word. Told you we'd have fun. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. Thanks for sticking around, if you've stuck around. I was going to do a follow-up to the Horizon video with another video about this year's other self-financed insane passion project by a crazy old man, Megalopolis, but I really couldn't think of anything interesting to say, even though I thought the movie itself was pretty interesting. Good? Maybe not, but certainly not the horrible embarrassment everybody seemed to think it was. I guess let me know if you saw it and what you thought, and also how you feel about The Shining, as long as you're not going to be a weirdo about it. I'm sure there are already plenty of angry comments from angry little MAGA boys who didn't watch the video but don't like that I don't like their dear leader, and you don't have to read or respond to those. I know I don't. Okay, bye.
Urge to kill, fading, 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 rising, fading, fading, gone.
So much for Plan B.